Yeah.
Host 1, male. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hi, I'm Oliver. Host 2, female. Hi, Emily. Host 1, male. Science and Easy English. Host 2, female. Why are some people left-handed? Host 1, male. So, imagine you are stepping into a life-or-death combat scenario, and your opponent's entire physiology just operates completely backward to everything your brain is trained to anticipate. Host 2, female. Yeah, that would be terrifying. Total breaks all your muscle memory. Host 1, male. Exactly. And for over 1 million years, an elite 10% of the human population has possessed this kind of biological cheat code. Host 2, female. It is wild because we live in a world that is just aggressively tailored for right-handed people. But that 10% stubbornly persists. Host 1, male.
Right. And it's not just a modern thing either. Like, the archaeological record totally backs this up. Host 2, female. This 90-10 split is not just some localized cultural habit or a byproduct of modern society. We see it going way back. Host 1, male. Like, how far back are we talking? Host 2, female. I mean, we see it in 500,000-year-old stone tools.
The flanking patterns on them indicate right-handed strikes. Host 1, male. Wow, 500,000 years. Host 2, female. Yeah, and we even see in the wear patterns of Neanderthal teeth. Plus, if you look at Paleolithic cave paintings, the hand stencils left on the walls are overwhelmingly left hands. Host 1, male. Wait, so if the stencil is left hand, that means host 2, female. It implies the artists were using their right hand to actually blow the pigment through the bone tubes. Host 1, male. That is incredibly cool. Host 2, female. Right. Even 5,000-year-old rock paintings in India depict hunters holding bows with a right-handed draw. So humans and our ancestors have heavily favored the right hand for an incredibly long time. Host 1, male. 1 million years of right-handed dominance. So whether you are a lefty who has spent a lifetime navigating a world of smeared ink and awkward scissors, or a righty wondering why your brain defaults the way it does, we are diving deep today. Host 2, female. Yes, we are going to look at a massive stack of research. Host 1, male.
Yeah, from genome-wide association studies to evolutionary game theory.
And our mission for this deep dive is to completely change how you view human asymmetry. Host 2, female. Because if this ratio has held steady for 1 million years, the logical starting point has to be our DNA. Host 1, male. Right? You would think there's just a left-handed switch in there somewhere. Host 2, female. Exactly. The assumption usually goes that there must be a specific switch in the genome, like a binary code, where you either inherit the right-handed variant or the left-handed one. Host 1, male, right? Like flipping a light switch on or off. But based on these massive genomic studies, it's not that simple, is it? Host 2, female.
Yeah.
Not at all. Especially when you look at data from the UK Biobank, which analyzed 500,000 people. It's clearly not a simple switch. Host 1, male. So it's more like a sprawling, highly complex soundboard with dozens of tiny dials. Host 2, female. That is a great way to put it. The search for a single isolated lefty gene was a major focus for decades, but modern sequencing has effectively put that myth to rest. Host 1, male. So handedness is polygenic. There's no one gene pulling the strings. Host 2, female. Right. It is the result of many different genetic variants, each exerting a tiny additive influence. And when researchers map out the total variance in handedness across the population, genetics only accounts for about 25% of it. Host 1, male. Only 25%. That instantly complicates how we think about family inheritance. I mean, we all know handedness sort of runs in families. Host 2, female. It does, but the data shows a really nuanced picture. Like if you have 2 right-handed parents, there is still roughly a 10% chance their child will be left-handed. Host 1, male. And if both parents are left-handed, does it guarantee a lefty kid? Host 2, female. No, actually. That probability jumps, but only to about 25 or 27%, so it's far from a guarantee. Host 1, male. That is way lower than I would have guessed. Host 2, female. Yeah, and interestingly, the data points to a stronger maternal effect. Host 1, male. Really? So a left-handed mother is statistically more likely to pass on the trait than a left-handed father. Host 2, female. And when geneticists drill down into the specific readings of the genome responsible for this 25%, they isolate dozens of distinct variants. Host 1, male. Like I saw there's a recent meta-analysis pointing to 41 common genetic markers linked to left-handedness. Host 2, female. Yes, but the really compelling part of the research involves a much rarer genetic variant called TUB4B. Host 1, male. TUB4B. That sounds like a droid from Star Wars. What does it do? Host 2, female. Well, this gene dictates the production of microtubules. Host 1, male. Okay, and microtubules are like the internal scaffolding of our cells, right? Host 2, female, right? And they give the cell its physical structure. But they also act as microscopic conveyor belts moving materials around inside the cell. Host 1, male, which sounds important. Host 2, female, is crucial. During the very early embryonic stages, when a fertilized egg is just beginning to divide, these microtubules help establish the entire left-right axis of the human body. Host 1, male. Oh, wow. So they are the reason your heart develops on the left side of your chest cavity and your liver develops on the right. Host 2, female. Precisely. So finding rare variants in this specific microtubule building gene that are linked to left-handedness is huge. Host 1, male. Because it implies our hand preference isn't just about motor skills. It is intimately tied to the foundational asymmetrical blueprints of how our entire body is constructed from day one. Host 2, female.
Exactly. It is woven into our deepest developmental biology. Host 1, male. Hey, here's where it gets really interesting, though, because even with genes like TUB4B and those 41 other variants, the prominent genetic model right now argues something entirely different. Host 2, female. Yeah, you were talking about the right shift theory. Host 1, male.
Yeah.
Yes, the right shift theory, which basically argues that our DNA doesn't actually carry active instructions to make someone left-handed. Host 2, female. Right? It reframes the entire concept of inheritance. It suggests that these genetic dials don't offer a choice between left and right. Host 1, male. So what do? Host 2, female. They provide a strong bias, a developmental shift toward right-handedness, and the vast majority of the population inherits this bias. Host 1, male.
But if you happen to lack those specific genetic markers, your brain doesn't automatically default to left-handedness, right? Host 2, female. Exactly. Instead, your handedness basically becomes a biological coin toss. It's left up to random developmental fluctuations. Host 1, male. So leaving you with a 50-50 chance of favoring your left or right hand. Host 2, female. Yeah, left-handedness isn't a coded instruction. It's just what happens when the genetic thumb is removed from the right-handed scale. Host 1, male. That is fascinating. But wait, if the genetic blueprint only explains 25% of the handedness puzzle, something else must be actively influencing that biological coin toss. Host 2, female. Right, which leaves 75% of the environment. Host 1, male. And based on these studies, we aren't talking about the environment of like a kindergarten classroom where you learn to write. We have to look at the environment of the womb. Host 2, female. Yes, because hand preference manifests long before a toddler picks up a crayon. Host 1, male. Right. I read that ultrasound observations show fetuses actively displaying a distinct preference for sucking their right thumb over their left. Host 2, female. They do. And they overwhelmingly tend to rest with their heads turned to the right side of the uterus. Host 1, male. So they're already picking a side before they're even born. Host 2, female. Exactly. And when we look at the environmental factors that disrupt this early pattern, they are surprisingly physical. For example, left-handedness is significantly more common in individuals who are part of a multiple birth. Host 1, male, like twins or triplets. Host 2, female. Yeah, and it also correlates strongly with lower birth weights. Host 1, male. Okay, and the sources also point to ultrasound exposure during pregnancy as a potential factor, which sounds kind of alarming at first. Host 2, female. It does sound scary, but the proposed mechanism makes some kind of sense. The hypothesis is that the acoustic waves from frequent ultrasounds might cause microscopic vibrations or mild heating. Host 1, male. And that subtly disrupts the delicate migration of neurons as the fetal brain lateralizes. Host 2, female. Right, it just gently nudges that developmental trajectory. But honestly, the most bizarre environmental correlation in the data has to be the season of birth. Host 1, male. Well, yeah, this part blew my mind. The studies indicate that left-handedness is significantly more common in people born in the spring or early summer. Host 2, female, specifically between March and July. Host 1, male. I mean, that sounds like straight-up astrology. Host 2, female. It really does. But there are actually solid biological mechanisms driving it. Host 1, male. Like, how does being born in May make you left-handed? Host 2, female. Well, think about the timeline. If a baby is born in the spring or summer, it means the crucial early and middle stages of their fetal brain development took place deep in the winter. Host 1, male.
Oh, I see.
So it's about what the mother experienced during the winter. Host 2, female. Exactly. One hypothesis is that this exposes the developing fetus to a higher rate of winter viral infections. Host 1, male, like the flu. Host 2, female. Yeah. When a pregnant mother catches a winter flu, her immune response creates a surge of cytokines, which are inflammatory proteins. Host 1, male, and those cross the placenta. Host 2, female. Right, and they can subtly alter the trajectory of fetal brain development. Host 1, male. Wow. And there's another theory about sunlight too, right? Host 2, female. Yes, focusing on vitamin D. The mother experiences lower sunlight and therefore lower vitamin D levels during those dark winter months. Host 1, male. And since vitamin D acts essentially as a hormone crucial for neurodevelopment, a deficiency during that critical mid-gestation window might easily influence the brain's asymmetry. Host 2, female. Exactly. We also see early environmental impacts from specific pharmaceuticals. Host 1, male. Oh, right, the EES data. Host 2, female. Yeah, the data shows individuals exposed in utero to DES, which is a synthetic estrogen heavily prescribed in the mid-20th century to prevent miscarriage as well. They show higher rates of left-handedness. Host 1, male. So, synthetic hormones crossing the placental barrier seemingly interact with the developing brain's lateralization process. Host 2, female. They do, but we do have to be careful when weighing that massive 75% environmental influence. Host 1, male. Why is that? Host 2, female. Because the word environment also encompasses the intense sociocultural pressures that occur after birth. Host 1, male. Oh, right, the cultural pushback. I mean, for centuries, society systematically forced left-handed children to write with their right hands. Host 2, female. Yes, it's heavily stigmatized. Host 1, male. And that bias is literally baked into human language. Like the Latin word for left is sinister. Host 2, female? Wow, yeah. Host 1, male. And the German word linkish translates to awkward or clumsy. Even in French, gauche means left, but also tactless. Host 2, female. So you have to wonder how much of the historical data is skewed by this stigmatization. Like when we look at older generations, are we seeing biological right-handers or just suppressed left-handers?
Host 1.
Exactly. And the UK Biobank study illustrates this perfectly. The prevalence of reported left-handedness increases significantly in their younger participant cohorts compared to the older ones. Host 2, female. And that obviously isn't evidence of human biology rapidly changing over 50 years.
Yeah.
Host 1, male. No, not at all. It's just evidence that the harsh cultural pressure to force left-handed children into right-handed conformity has finally relaxed in many parts of the world. Host 2, female. Which makes sense. In societies that still maintain strict taboos against left-handedness, the reported rates remain artificially suppressed. Host 1, male. So that 75% is just a messy blend of winter viruses, synthetic estrogen crowding in the womb, and stubborn social conformity. Host 2, female. Pretty much. Host 1, male. But moving beyond how handedness develops, we have to look at why the brain even cares which hand holds the pen. What is this asymmetry actually doing for our cognitive function? Host 2, female. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the core principle here is brain lateralization. Host 1, male. Those are dividing up the work. Host 2, female, exactly. The human brain is divided into two hemispheres, but they don't perfectly mirror each other's responsibilities. Host 1, male. Right, so for the vast majority of right-handers, the left hemisphere of the brain acts as the dominant processing center for both language and fine motor skills. Host 2, female. Yes, and it operates like a highly optimized company. Host 1, male. Love that analogy. If the left hemisphere is already running the communications department, handling complex language syntax and vocabulary, and it's also running the fine motor control department, the right hemisphere doesn't need to waste metabolic energy duplicating those same tasks. Host 2, female. Right, it is completely free to specialize in different domains. Things like spatial awareness, facial recognition, and processing complex emotions. Host 1, male. So the brain basically avoids redundancy by dividing the labor.
Yeah.
Host 2, female. Yeah. Exactly. And because motor control is cross-wired, meaning the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, tying fine motor skills to the right hand is incredibly efficient. Host 1, male, because the left hemisphere is already doing the heavy lifting for language processing anyway. Host 2, female. Right, the pathways are just consolidated. But the neuroscientific data reveals a really fascinating twist when we look at left-handers. Host 1, male. Yeah, because you would naturally assume a left-hander has a completely mirrored brain setup. Host 2, female. That is what most people think. Host 1, male, right? Like if their right hand is in the dominant one, the right hemisphere should be the one handling language and fine motor control. It's not what happens. Is host to female? No, not at all. The brain scans show that the majority of single-born left-handers still process language in their left hemisphere exactly like right-handers do. Host 1, male. That is so weird. So their motor control flips, but their language center stays put. Host 2, female. Yes, it reveals that while handedness and language lateralization are deeply connected, they are not rigidly tethered to one another. Host 1, male. And this overlap actually provides a massive clue for evolutionary anthropologists studying human origins, right? Host 2, female. It does. The prevailing theory right now is that vocal speech likely evolved from the lateralized control of hand gestures. Host 1, male. Oh, wow. So long before our ancestors could articulate complex vocal sentences, they communicated through highly sophisticated hand movements. Host 2, female. Exactly. And because the left hemisphere was already specialized for those precise communicative manual gestures, it basically provided the neural architecture that eventually housed vocal language as it evolved. Host 1, male. That is a brilliant evolutionary hack. But that evolutionary link brings up a glaring contradiction in the research. Host 2, female. What do you mean? Host 1, male. Well, if being a left-hander comes with potential developmental stressors like we were talking about, correlations with lower birth weights, viral inflammation, and just the sheer physical danger of operating tools and machinery designed for right-handers, natural selection should have erased this trait. Host 2, female. You would think so, yeah. Host 1, male. I mean, 500,000 years is more than enough time for evolution to filter out a trait that causes systemic disadvantages. There has to be a hidden survival benefit that outweighs the physical risks of living in a right-handed world. Host 2, female. There is. And the survival benefit is found in a concept called negative frequency dependent selection. Host 1, male. Negative frequency dependent selection. Break that down for us. Host 2, female. In evolutionary biology, this describes a trait that becomes advantageous strictly because it is rare. Host 1, male. So the rarity itself is the superpower. Host 2, female. Exactly. The moment it becomes too common, the advantage disappears. And for left-handers, that rare advantage translates into a massive strategic edge in physical combat. Host 1, male. The fighting hypothesis. This is where the statistics really get wild for me. Host 2, female. Oh, it makes perfect sense, though. Picture an early hominid in a life-or-death hand-to-hand fight. Host 1, male. Okay, I'm picturing it. Holding a weapon in the right hand naturally blades the body right. It protects the heart, which is on the left, and exposes the less vulnerable right side of the chest to the opponent. Host 2, female. Right. But when a right-hander faces a left-hander, that entire defensive geometry is completely broken. Host 1, male. Because the left-hander exposes their less vulnerable right side while simultaneously attacking from an angle the right-hander's brain is simply not conditioned to defend against. Host 2, female. Exactly. A right-hander spends their entire life fighting other right-handers since they make up 90% of the population. Host 1, male. So they have literally zero muscle memory for parrying a left-sided attack. Host 2, female. None. The left-hander, however, is completely in their element. They spend their entire life practicing against right-handers. It grants them a lethal element of surprise. Host 1, male. And the crazy part is we don't even have to rely on anthropological speculation for this. The sources show hard statistical proof of this dynamic in modern interactive sports. Host 2, female. Yes, if you look at the elite echelons of boxing, fencing, tennis, baseball, or cricket, really any sport requiring rapid antagonistic reaction times, left-handers are vastly overrepresented. Host 1, male. They make up significantly more than 10% of the top-tier athletes in those disciplines. Host 2, female. And the mechanism is identical. Right-handed athletes just aren't conditioned to read their angles. Host 1, male. But the critical factor to remember is that this evolutionary advantage relies entirely on scarcity. Host 2, female.
Right.
Because if left-handers suddenly reproduced to make up 50% of the population, right-handers would adapt. Host 1, male. They would get used to fighting them, and the element of surprise would vanish entirely. Host, female. Exactly. Evolutionary sources effectively created a mathematical equilibrium. Left-handedness provides enough of a lethal survival benefit to persist in the human genome, but it comes with enough cooperative and developmental costs that it stabilizes at around 10%. Host 1, male. It's like a perfectly balanced equation, and we can actually observe society shifting this evolutionary pressure in real time. Host 2, female. Oh, you mean the IPO study? Host 1, Yes. The sources highlight this study on the Ipoh people in Papua, Indonesia. It's a traditional non-industrialized society where tribal combat using close-quarters weapons was prevalent until very recently. Host 2, female. Right, researchers found that the heritability of handedness in that society was staggeringly high. It was around 0.56. Host 1, male, which is massive. But when you measure modern industrialized societies, that heritability drops to 0.20. Host 2, female. It perfectly illustrates how our environment acts as the engine of our evolution. Host 1, male. Because in a society where close-quarters combat is a frequent requirement for survival, the geometric advantage of being left-handed exerts a very strong selective pressure. Host 2, female. Natural selection highly values the trait in that context, but in modern industrialized societies, two major shifts occurred. Host 1, male. First, the invention of long-range weapons completely negated the left-handed combat advantage. I mean, a bullet doesn't care which hand pulled the trigger. Host 2, female. Exactly. And second, the automation of heavy manual labor relaxed the evolutionary pressure for extreme hand specialization. Host 1, male. So the rules of survival changed, and the selective pressures changed right along with them. Host 2, female. Exactly. Host 1, male. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've seen that left-handedness isn't just a simple toggle switch in our DNA. Host 2, female. No, it is an incredibly complex cocktail. Host 1, male. Yeah. Of polygenic traits like that microtubule building TUB4B gene mixed with the amount of time you spend turning your head in the womb, your exposure to winter viruses, and a million-year-old evolutionary combat trick that kept lefties alive against the odds. Host 2, female. It really proves that handedness isn't just a quirk of penmanship. It is a literal window into human survival and brain efficiency. Host 1, male. Truly.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, there is one final, somewhat mind-bending phenomenon from the research that kind of challenges everything we've just discussed about genetics and environment. Host 2, female. Oh, the mirror twins. Host 1, male. Yes, the existence of mirror twins. We know that identical twins share the exact same DNA sequence. They're, for all intents and purposes, genetic clones. Host 2, female. Yet in about 23% of identical twin pairs, they end up with opposite-handedness. Host 1, male. 23%. That is wild. One is a righty and the other is the lefty. Host 2, female. Which is just fascinating. Host 1, male. Lewis Carroll actually explored this concept through the looking glass with the characters Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Host 2, female.
Oh.
Host 1, male. Yeah, he envisioned them not just as twins, but as perfect three-dimensional mirror images of each other. What chemists would actually call enantiomers. Host 2, female. That is a great comparison. Because in a real biological context, these twins share the exact same genetic blueprint. Host 1, male. And they share the exact same uterine environment at the exact same time exposed to the exact same seasonal factors and maternal hormones. Host 2, female. And yet their brains lateralize differently and they favor different hands. Host 1, male. It's crazy. It raises perhaps the deepest philosophical and biological question of this entire deep dive. Host 2, female. It really does. Because if two human beings can share 100% of their genetic code in the exact same developmental environment, yet still end up fundamentally differing in their brain lateralization and physical asymmetry, we have to reconsider human determinism. Host 1, male. Exactly. How much of our core identity, our physical wiring, is truly dictated by our DNA? Host 2, female. And how much of who we are is just a result of a random microscopic roll of the evolutionary dice during our first few days of cellular division? Host 1, male. We constantly want biology to be clean. We want a binary right or left, broken or not broken picture of human development. Host 2, female. But it rarely is. Host 1. Yeah. The deeper we dive into that 10% of the population, the more we realize that human asymmetry isn't a simple equation at all. It's a chaotic, beautiful dance of genetics, environmental pressures, and pure chance. Think about that the next time you bump elbows at a dinner party.